So basically the premise of this talk is that people spend, or millions of people spend billions of hours doing hard work for free. But it's hard work that they want to do. It's playing games. So what if we could harness all of this excitement and engagement that people voluntarily do every day into our lives and experiences, like web or mobile apps, or employee productivity, or education in a classroom, or job satisfaction. And gamification, when it's implemented well, has the promise to do all of these things. So my background is I was a gamer for many years. I played all sorts of games, and I was homeschooled, so I had a lot of time to do it. I played RPGs, strategy games, war games, classic games, all of those. And now I quit gaming years ago now, so I could focus on my career and real life in the real world. But I still think games are important, and I still think it's important to figure out how we can engage people in appropriate manners and experiences. So that's what led me to create a gamification company almost 3 years ago now. It was called Amico, and it was a way to get people to participate in eco-friendly activities by get them recycling and eventually reducing their waste by using gamification techniques. So I didn't know much about gamification back then, but I went to a hackathon and I started this project. We came up with a lot of cool characters that everybody loved, and we had lots of these game features we just stuck wherever we could in the app. We had points and badges and a leaderboard and the option to catch these cute amichis like another similar game. But our idea never really took off, and quite frankly, it was never that fun to use. And we kept pivoting and coming up with new ways and sinking more and more time into this. We came up with these mini games that people could play that would tie into the main system, like card games. We also had a trash monster, and you had to flick recycling items into the right bucket, which was also not that fun. So we learned a lot from that, and we learned that throwing game elements into an application without thinking about the strategy isn't a good plan for success. And it also doesn't turn a bad idea into a good one just because you've put some game elements in there. So users aren't actually tricked by game elements. Users aren't dumb. It needs to be a good system with game elements as an addition to it. And so basically we have reincorporated, but this time it's an education gamification company. So I do come from an education background. In my day job, I build education software, and I also have most of my experience with gamification in education, but this talk I'm going to try to cover more broadly how gamification works and how we might be able to apply it to applications. So there's a couple different levels to go through to discuss gamification. First of all, we have to figure out or define what is gamification, what are games, and then go through some frameworks like lenses to understand gamification, and then talk about some tactics and finish off with some of the finer details at the end. So, what is gamification? So gamification has this official definition, and it's the use of game design elements in non-game context. So games have actually been very well studied. Even thousands of years ago, there's writings about games, and especially in the last 3 or 4 decades, since we have video games and all these instant feedback systems, they've been very well studied. Gamification has been studied a lot less, but we're trying to take these game elements that we've studied for so long and put them into things that aren't games. And it's been called human-centered design. Usually when people are building apps, it's the functionality of the app. The to-do list, it will post to-dos. That's the functionality, but what about the human motivation behind it? What will get the person to post the to-do? So that's really what gamification does. It's concerned first with the human motivation, and then designing for the human being and the motivation behind the action, and then building the system around that. So It's kind of opposite from what happens a lot of times now. It does overlap some with like user experience design and some other types of human-centric design. So why do we want to take game elements outside of games? Because games really have to engage people. People could just quit playing. They don't have to play games. Nobody has to. So that's really why we steal all of these like good, well-tested elements. And gamification can really come in many different forms. And just like in gamification, us as application developers or entrepreneurs, we have to also incentivize people using our products and our apps to be engaged as well. So it's really nice to be able to look and dig through these design elements and see if they work in our situation. So let's look at some quick examples of gamification. I'm just going to breeze past these before I start the rest of the talk. Gamification of physical activities, like Fitocracy or this one that I use, Zombies Run. It creates a narrative to gamify it. There's also gamification of hospital patients, in this case, kids in pain. How are they going to fill out their pain journals every day? Well, gamify it. Education is a huge area of gamification now. This is Free Code Camp. Of course, I have to pitch Free Code Camp as a contributor. They do a really good job gamifying their system. And Duolingo is another language learning app. Lots of progress bars and different fun game elements get people to use it to learn languages every day. Sales and marketing is another huge area of gamification. Salesforce actually, they might be the biggest like sales and marketing company, and they bought a gamification company, so now they're selling gamification service to their users. And this is a very interesting one. People are gamifying onboarding experiences. You know, how can you increase conversions and get people into your system? Through free trials, how do you get them to switch to a paid one? So Autodesk has done a good job gamifying that process. And of course, social media has more of this social game aspect, and all the social media companies out there do this with like social interaction, real-time feedback, and stuff like that. And finally, there's product gamification. Now this company, Quirky, is really interesting because they launch 2 new products every single month. How is that possible for any company to do? Well, they gamify the system. And they do such an effective job at it, and they bring the community together and people outside together to pitch ideas to them. So they're able to launch actually a lot of really good products in a very short amount of time. So here are some quick misconceptions about gamification that maybe you've heard before. It's really expensive. This one kind of goes along with it. It's hard to implement, which isn't true. You can make it as small or as big as you want. And a lot of times if you go overboard in the beginning, you've just done too much and it will probably fail. And then it's just points, badges, and leaderboards. So this last one, oh wait, one more, yeah. It's not just points, badges, and leaderboards. That's just the most common type of gamification. And it's the one that, since the term gamification came to prominence maybe around 2010 or so, that's the one that all these companies that popped up were just pitching to companies like, hey, I can add gamification, but it was just like points, badges, and leaderboards thrown at any site. So a lot of people, or some people, think that it usually fails, so it's not worth it. And it is true that gamification or gamified systems usually fail, but it's a bit misleading because most apps fail. So it's not just gamified apps, it's all apps. And gamification, when it's implemented well, has helped a lot of companies. So I think there's a lot to learn from the cases that fail and the cases that have done really, really well. It's still a new developing technology. So what is a game? Or what makes a game a game? The first thing that most people think of is that a game is fun, right? Because why would anybody play a game if it wasn't fun? But then there's also like free play, which isn't the game, but it's also fun. Or there are games that aren't really fun, like Cookie Clicker. Has anyone played Cookie Clicker? Yes? It's like the older version of Cow Clicker, just as pointless. I played this a lot for some reason when I was younger. And you just click on cookies, get more cookies, get grandmas to bake cookies, and all kinds of other stuff. And it's completely pointless. And there are a lot of these games. So it's not actually a stipulation of games that it has to be fun. So the creator of Civilization came out and said, well, a game is just a series of meaningful choices. But there are some stipulations to these choices to differentiate a game from play. So some elements of games, beyond making a series of meaningful choices, are that it needs to be voluntary. You can't really force someone to play a game. That there should be some kind of sense of progression. You see this a lot with leveling up or something along those lines. There's also feedback, especially with video games. The advent of video games allowed people to get instant feedback, and it's kind of this addictive feedback loop where you get feedback on your progression and stats and everything in real time. And there should be some kind of goal or some kind of purpose behind why you're playing the game. Now, these are just the core elements of games. But there are so many, there are just thousands and thousands of other elements that don't necessarily apply to all games, but they're also important to talk about and think about when designing. So here are some elements taken from games that we use. Games give us these epic stories. If you've played Earthbound, this is one of my favorite games of all time. Anyways, they give you epic stories and these narratives and adventures. And not only that, they give you challenges and quests that make you feel fulfilled playing games. They also give you real-time feedback, like I said, with player stats. You can use and collect items, which adds a sense of randomness because you don't know when you're going to get an item, what you're going to get, if you're going to catch something. And that adds some curiosity and intrigue. And then this is an example of a leaderboard from the popular Madden NFL game to invite friendly and safe competition. So in this game or these types of games, you can really be creative and try new things to try to win because you don't lose anything in real life and you can just start over. You're free to fail. This is a popular social game called Empires and Allies. Some of the elements of the game are there's points for keeping score, resource collection, leveling up, progression, quests, avatars, by the way, which avatars are idealized versions of ourselves that positively affect us in real life. And there's also a lot of social aspects, challenging your friends. And talking about social aspects, they can be as simple as this is an older game, Age of Empires 2, and if you played online, there was this little chat down there. Modern games usually have, well, this is a live streamer, but they usually have, you know, the gamer headset, and you have the voice chat and everything. So that's more of an interactive element. They also have elements of suspense and time limitation. So if you've played Mario before, you probably know the feeling of adrenaline and the music that's playing leading up to when you're running out of time at the end, like the GIF. And all of these things really create so many emotions inside of us. And game creators have really, really done a good job in many cases, of appealing to our core emotions as humans to make us want to play these games and enjoy playing them. So some of these emotions we feel might be excitement, or competition, or curiosity, or relief, or this relatively new feeling that we've adopted called fiero, if I'm pronouncing that right. It's an Italian word for pride that we don't have a good translation for in English, but it's that feeling of an epic win in a game. And if you've gamed before, you've probably all felt that. And if you haven't, it feels something like this, like, yes, I beat the final bad guy, or I got past this challenge I couldn't get by. Because good games are always like at the limits of our ability, and we always feel really good and challenged playing them. So there's a lot of good literature now about the different emotions that games evoke in us, and the different chemicals that they produce based off of the different actions that we perform in the game. So all of these things from games actually tie into gamification as well, because we're using, in kind of a microcosm, we're using individual game elements pieced together. So while they're not really addictive like games, we do invoke a lot of the same emotions when we're gamifying our systems. So how do we take these game elements and start to apply the tactics or the strategies into businesses and applications? So there are many different gamification frameworks to help us do that at this point. In the last decade or so, researchers and some early gamification entrepreneurs have come out with these frameworks that are really helpful when starting off in gamification, to tie everything together and to figure out, what are the first steps to gamifying my system. So I believe the first framework that came out wasn't even about gamification, but it's evolved to apply to gamification today. It's about different types of players. So someone named Bartle came out with this, what he called the taxonomy of players, and then other people evolved more modern iterations of this. So it's a bit nuanced, but I'm just going to cover in general, and then if you're interested, you can look up all the different player types. It's really hard to define people categorically because there's so many different kinds of people, but it's important to understand that we're motivated by different things, and even the same person playing different games might be motivated by different things. Because we're all humans, but it's important, especially when we're thinking of the design of an application, when we're creating personas. It's nice to have these gamified personas, like what is motivating my players or my users, and then build off of that. So this is kind of a listified version of that. So if you're going to include something like a leaderboard in your app, well, that might be great if it's a sales team and they're thriving on this head-to-head competition, but it might not be the right motivator for other kinds of people, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's good to think about these different types of people and which elements are going to turn some people away and which elements will help some other people. So if you have a questionnaire, when you're doing user testing, a lot of times, at least in my company, or my previous company, we would watch the user while they were, I guess that's the Google method or something, like watch the user while they're interacting with the application and then have some questions at the end. So it's nice to find out about the motivations of the user and really what drives them and dig down into that. And then, of course, player types can be infinitely broken down into many more categories about like what is going to interest different types of people. So that's just a general about like personas and gamification. But to really dig down into human motivation, there's another framework called Octalysis. And this one might be the most robust gamification framework out there today. It's a bit hard to see from there. I'll zoom in a second. Actually, I'll zoom in now. Yeah. So it really gets to the core of what influences us. And if you start at the top going clockwise, then there's 8 different words or pairs of words in the middle, and they're called core drives, things that motivate us. And then they're kind of connected to other different gamified elements that will appeal to people who are motivated by those drives. So again, here's a listified version that's a little bit easier to read. So if you look at the official guide to this framework, it tells people to rate your system. Like if you already built an app, maybe you wanted to see how it appealed to people, you could go through all of these different core drives and be like, oh, I have a lot of maybe social influence and relatedness, but I don't have so much scarcity and impatience, which you don't have to have all of them. And I don't know if there's any apps that have all of them. But it's good to see what you're appealing to and then figure out why you're appealing to those types of motivations. So for example, if you're using a badge system, you can appeal to that user's need to feel accomplished. If your app is doing social good, maybe, you're appealing to that user's desire to feel this epic meaning and calling in their life, like they're doing something good for other people. If you have evergreen mechanics, like user-generated content, maybe it's some form of art or they're constructing something in your virtual world, then you might have core drive, you might appeal to core drive 2, because it allows people to express their creativity and kind of see the results of it, and then perhaps even get feedback off of what they made. So my old Amico app, the gamified recycling project, I kind of graded it as an example. There's no set amount of check marks, but I just kind of put a moderate amount. We did appeal to core drive 1 because studies show that most people know that they should recycle and do all these things, but they just don't. Most people don't. Core drive 3, we appealed a little bit. We had a forum, but it wasn't really that good. Core drive 4, because we could randomly catch these creatures, and you get the idea. So I just kind of went back and rated the app to see where we stood on all these. So there's another framework called the 6D Gamification Design Framework. It's by a university professor at, I think, University of Pennsylvania. And he's written some books and teaches a Coursera course on this also. So in my opinion, this is the most practical framework. So if you look into Octalysis, it talks a lot about user motivation, and it's very deep because there's actually 5 different levels. So that was just level 1 of the framework, but you can dig really deep into the framework to apply it to your system. But this professor kind of created more of a practical one that you can use right away and apply to any product or application. So, of course, you need to define business objectives and then go through all of these steps and then end up deploying your app with any metrics you want to watch the application. And in the process, it's really important to focus on the human-centered design, because you don't want to just say, oh, these are all the objectives and listify it like a robot, because we really want our users to feel how we want them to feel and engage with them during the experience. So I took an example from a recent experience I had, actually, and just thought I would make it a gamified version. So there's this construction and finance company. And let's say this company handles budgeting, income, expenses, tracking employee hours for construction companies, which is actually an unbelievably hard thing to do. And the apps are sold B2B, and they already work. The problem is employees aren't entering their hours regularly, the construction workers out in the field. They're supposed to clock in and out for mandatory breaks, when they get there, when they leave. But it's a complete nightmare to manage because they either forget or they don't do it or whatever. And then the bookkeepers in the office, they don't enter their income and expenses regularly. So then the company doesn't even know where they stand. So there's a really hard problem, and all of these tasks are monotonous tasks. So maybe they're a little bit easier to motivate people for. So these are the basic company objectives. They want their employees to do things correctly and on time, and the game features should blend in with the current system. So the target behaviors are what we want the users to do after we implement the new system. We want the workers to clock in and out right away and appropriately when they're supposed to, and the office workers to make it a habit of entering their expenses when they're supposed to. So we can kind of describe our players. I just took these demographics, but you can get a lot more granular from it. These were just from the example that I had recently worked with. And yeah, so those are the players. And so this is really where the gamification strategy comes in, and where I really grease-boarded everything and tried to figure out, like, you know, who are the players, what are their motivations, because we have a tech-savvy group in the office and a not tech-savvy group who's tired and just wants to get to lunch or whatever. So how do we get these players, these different types of players, to perform their target behaviors? And using engagement loops, motivators, actions, feedback, progression, whatever we can. So for a very simplified version, we said for the construction workers, we're going to have this point system because we want something simple to use but still accurate. So they can get these points when they do things correctly, and when their team does something correctly, then they get extra points. So it's kind of motivation for them to encourage other people that work with them to do their job. And since most of them aren't super users, they're not that tech savvy, so they're not going to care about digital assets or points. They're going to be like, whatever, if we just give them points. So you can make these points exchangeable for something of value, like gift cards. They can earn rewards after a certain amount of time or a certain amount of points. And we could start using this system and test whether or not randomness works. Like, would it be good to maybe give them bonus points? It's probably not good to take away points or give them a random amount of points or see what works along those lines. This is just an example. So the office workers are a bit more tech savvy, and they're entering in details, which is quite monotonous. So it might be good to try motivating them by creating a challenge. So let's create a program that counts the rows of income and expenses, or however we can measure what they're doing, and then give them a progress bar and a leaderboard. Maybe if it works, we can test if it works or not, and give them titles based off of how well they perform versus themselves and what they should be doing. So something to note here is that extrinsic motivators, like exchangeable points, are best used to gamify monotonous, non-creative tasks. If you've read the book Drive, it's by Mr. Pink. I can't remember his first name, but he talks a lot about human motivation and extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations, and that these extrinsic motivations are really good for gamifying and getting people to do monotonous tasks that are maybe hard to do or people just don't want to do otherwise. And for creative tasks, people are more motivated with these intrinsic desires for creative tasks. So these are the perfect gamification techniques for this scenario. The fun, so I don't know how much fun it is, but people do sense, a lot of people do get a sense of fun from community and social dynamics. Maybe they think it's fun to collect points for rewards. There's also a competition and challenge, which will break up the tasks. It probably makes things a little bit more fun for people. And there's also the instant feedback that the office workers get, which is a great motivator, and a lot of people will rate things as being more fun when they get that feedback. So deploying the app. So of course we have to deploy all the technology. That's obvious. But we also need to deploy analytics, because when we're deploying gamified systems, human motivation is very tricky to deal with. So maybe we're motivating them really well to perform the tasks, or maybe we've chosen the wrong motivational tool. So we really need to keep up with the metrics and analytics and revise and see, like, you know, how can I make this better or tweak it? And that's a really important part of gamification, not just leaving it out there. So let's talk about some tactics to implement with these frameworks. and some of the different ways to gamify a system. Of course, there's the most common points, badges, and leaderboards. And while they've been potentially overused, they're still really valuable tools and have helped a lot of companies. So here's one of the most important stories in the history of gamification. Has everyone heard of Foursquare? It's a really popular app. I don't know if people still use it. Okay, people still use it. So Foursquare is a really good example of PBLs that worked. Now, I had to dig up old pictures because they don't have all of these features anymore. But basically, they created a system for check-ins that completely failed before Foursquare. It was terrible and just flopped, I guess. I haven't used it. So in 2009, I think that's the year when they started their gamified system, they had 50,000 users. In 2010, with the help of gamification, they grew 3,400% in 1 year, and they got up to 10 million users, I believe, the next year. And people were so obsessed with checking in or getting the title of mayor or collecting these badges and all this other stuff for their favorite locations. And it was a huge success in user engagement and acquisition. And I'll talk more about the continuation of that story later. That's a good example of points, badges, and leaderboards implemented well. And then, of course, FreeCodeCamp. So FreeCodeCamp also does a really good job. As I've experienced, I also run a local group to help people learn how to code where I live. And we use a lot of progress bars. There's indicators of how often you've submitted code. Of course, I haven't used the platform as a learner in a while. But we also count points. So every time you complete a challenge, you get points for it. You get a sense of, yeah, I completed the challenge, and some kind of progress metric. And we used to have a leaderboard for different parts of the site. I think it's broken right now, but that was always fun to look at, that we could see like who's on top with points, and we just have a lot of users now. We just have too many millions of users. But when the app was starting out, it was a really cool and fun thing to see. Oh, I'm going to skip this one and talk about progress indicators. So perhaps the most famous example of using progress indicators well is LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is not something you think of when you think of gamification, because it's like this serious business user application that's for networking and all these outgoing people. So it's not the first thing you would think of, but they did a really good job of implementing progress bars into their application. So the LinkedIn progress bar, well, they basically wanted people to fill out their profile information and to interact with the site more. So all they did, the picture to the very far left, they added a progress bar, and right away they got their people's profiles to be filled out at an increased rate of 50%. So 150% more people? No, 50% more people were filling out their profiles after they made this simple change that didn't even take much effort to do. Of course, they added other elements after that. So you can see who's viewed your profile. They also added the text, users with complete profiles are 40 times more likely to receive opportunities through LinkedIn, which is kind of like a Jones effect, which is loosely connected to gamification, I guess, but also sales. It's kind of like everyone else is doing it, you should do it too. And then they have lots of other constant feedback about your interaction and other people's interactions with your profile. So storytelling and narrative. Now, as humans, we naturally listen to and like powerful stories. And that's why it's included in so many games that just enthrall us and take us in. So I want to talk about two games first where I got really caught up in the story. If you played Red Alert 2, Command & Conquer, that was a great game. But there's battles and bad guys and whatever. And I really loved the story because there weren't a lot of female commandos, and I thought Tanya was awesome. And so I got really into the game, and I kept playing it nonstop because of the story. I mean, I had plenty of other war games to play. And RPGs are really good at also bringing people in with this epic story. You have to save the world and, whatever. So there are games, or there are systems that do that, that take these ideas of this epic story or narrative from games and gamify in action in real life. So I'm just using this because I use this every day, and it's making me run further, faster, and more often, just because I have this dialogue in my ears that I have to escape from zombies, and there's an intriguing story, and I can't wait to go running the next day to figure out who I'm going to save and how I'm going to build my town and stuff. It's kind of goofy, but it really, really works in some cases. So, collection sets. Now, collection sets are an element I'm seeing in more apps because I'm always interested in new apps that people are putting out, so I sign up for a ton of apps all the time, it feels like. I've been seeing more and more collection sets in apps with all these cool graphics, or not graphics, but design elements, I guess. But these usually appear in more heavily gamified system. They wouldn't appear in serious apps like LinkedIn and stuff, because it's a little bit harder to fit them inside a theme. But if you've used Habitica, it's a to-do app. That's basically what it is. But it's a to-do app with all these different game elements and collection sets and stuff you can get in randomness. And it appeals to, I was counting the core drives, it appeals to every different core drive in some way. You can go on group quests. There's so much you can do around just a to-do app. And it's actually, surprisingly, a successful company that employs a small team. And every time I visit their GitHub, they've updated something new. It's incredible what they've done with gamifying a to-do app. And then, of course, CryptoKitties. For some reason, it does seem like every time new technology comes out, people put cats in it. But they don't really do anything. They're just collectible items, but they make a fortune off of it because they're collectible items on the blockchain, and then they have rare ones and stuff. And so they really have monetized these digital collection sets, and a lot of other apps have done this as well. So onboarding tutorials. This is one of the best things about games, I think, is that you're not reading this big, boring manual. You can pretty much start playing right away if it's a well-designed game. If you've played Portal, Portal's been around a while. It's a good game. No bad guys, just fun to play. So when you start Portal, you're in this room by yourself, and you don't know what to do, and you're pressing buttons and trying to figure out the world. You end up I think picking up a clipboard, and the AI comes on, starts talking to you, and then you eventually figure out, I have to do this, and I have to do this, and you're learning as you go. There's nothing upfront you have to do, and it's fun, and it's exciting to be able to figure things out, and you feel really good about yourself. So as you progress through the game, solving puzzles and learning in real time. So there are a lot of apps who have taken this kind of system. Actually, some of them have used case studies from things like Portal and applied them into applications and the user onboarding experience to make it a better experience. So this is a Duolingo example. No, the first one's actually Canva. So user tutorials are always, or I can't say always, but they are more effective when you actively engage instead of just giving them a bunch of text or this video that people don't really finish watching. So if it's a to-do app, then how about having them, post their first to-do during the tutorial? So I'm going to go through two different apps that I think have done a really good job with this. And they allow the user to discover things when they need to and don't give them too much up front. So this is Canva. I guess it's an art app. I use it for designing logos or flyers or something like that. And you basically sign up for the app, and then it takes you through this challenge. And you have to edit things, add things, remove things. And there's a couple more steps that I skipped. And then congratulations, you finished the challenge, you can start going on. It's really simple. It takes a few minutes, and then people really remember it, and people enjoy this type of system more and are more engaged with it. So this is Duolingo, the language learning app. And they actually have kind of an interesting system because you don't have to sign up right away. So when you click Get Started, you just pick your language, and then it takes you through kind of like a mini language challenge where you have to do things you would do in the regular lessons, but it's just shorter. And then you can choose what you want to do. And then once you've gone through the challenges and you like it and you want to continue, then it has you create your profile. Now, this is important because a lot of applications will drop, or a lot of users will only use the application on that initial sign up. I think it's something like over 50% of apps are just used on that initial opening or sign up. So Duolingo, I don't know the exact stats for it, but they made this system so that people could actually interact with it, so they just don't sign up and drop off. Before they sign up, they have to interact with it and then like it and want to start getting points and coins and stuff. And then, oh, I want to save because I can see my progress bar and the coins I've gotten or the lingots or whatever the currency is. So it's a really nice system. And then there's also contests. Now, this is just a screenshot from a presentation someone gave. But contests are very, very useful in certain types of applications. Again, they're generally used, or generally the cases I've seen where they're used well are in sales and marketing applications. And in this particular case, they had some of their metrics increase by 250%. And then they had some where they compared what they did in 2 weeks of this kind of contest trial that they were running to about 7 months of work, and they actually did more in the 2 weeks than they did in all 7 months. So it can be a very effective way to gamify as long as it's well monitored and tracked and in certain situations. So there are so many more gamification elements and techniques that I'm not going to talk about because there's like thousands of them, but I think those are the most major ones that people are putting in their applications. But there are some problems and concerns, just like with anything else. And so, like I said before, gamification systems don't have quite the same problems as games do. Like you hear at game conferences, they talk about whales and how to make breakpoints so people can exit the app and addiction problems and stuff like that. You don't really have those same problems in gamification, but there are some ethical concerns and things like that. And it really boils down to how things are implemented and used in a specific system, because a leaderboard in one system doesn't necessarily equal a leaderboard in another system. So some ethical concerns. Coerced play. So if you're forcing people to compete in an unfriendly way, it's probably not a good thing, and it can actually cause mental problems for people, particularly in some cases they've already seen where companies try to do this with their employees. They build a gamified system for them, and it ends up causing mental problems and stress. There's also exploitationware is the term they're calling. Basically, when you're giving people meaningless rewards for an action that should be paid, that's not a very ethical thing to do. And that's whether, it's your employees, doing extra, or maybe people outside your system doing things that should be paid, that you should be hiring somebody for. Yeah, so gamers are people using our systems. I call users now gamers for some reason, but they're thinking and feeling, and they're real people. So I think that's the most important thing to design for, because I've been to a lot of hackathons and worked for various companies, and it's always exciting to work with new technology, build a new app, a new process. But I think the people part of the app is often undervalued. We're building this for real humans, and we have to consider the impact of what we're doing, especially when we're not playing with emotions, but we're using motivational techniques to motivate them in a certain way. So we have to make sure it's done in an ethical manner. And then, of course, there's engagement loops, which could be very good if it's a habit they want to build, like the user wants to remember to go running every day. We want to, remind them maybe, or engage them with the app at a certain time. But if it's a game like Cow Clicker and getting them addicted to doing nothing, basically, maybe it's a less ethical thing to do. Games like Zynga, if you've heard of Zynga, I think all of them are maybe Facebook or social games, but they've been criticized heavily for kind of these time-based, oh, your crops are dying, you have to come back right now, and getting people addicted to this engagement feedback loop in the app. So this is an example of a company that decided to gamify the system that their employees used. So they basically ended up putting leaderboards and everybody's rank of productivity. So they pitted people against each other, and some people were racing to get to the top, like the really competitive people, and people were skipping bathroom breaks, and it was a real mess. And they were doing some really unhealthy things, and then people who had maybe a physical disability or were older or pregnant, they couldn't keep up with the rest of their employees, so then their hours got cut. It was not a good situation. So it was actually a terrible way to handle gamification. And it's actually quite common now to gamify traffic. And it's been implemented well, and it's been implemented not so well. So this particular highway decided that, hey, we're going to charge more during peak hours, and we're going to show people so that they stop using the highway, or fewer people use it during these peak hours. But what it caused was all these people saying, oh, in 5 minutes or 2 minutes, the price is going to change, so I'm going to pull over to the side. So people were swerving over to the side. There was accidents and mayhem, and it was a really terribly designed idea because nobody seemed to have the foresight to say, oh, what are people, or how are people going to behave in the long run? So that system doesn't exist anymore. Some other issues with gamification. The research is still limited because it is obviously newer. There's a lot of research about games and human design with games, but the research about gamification, most of it seems to be from the last 8 years maybe. In the last couple years, I think they've started more long-term trials. But there are lots of examples and case studies, just not so much research about it. And about 70% of large companies use gamification tactics. So I'm sure that pretty soon we're going to see a lot more research coming out. And engagement, engagement might peak or does peak in some gamified systems near the beginning because people get excited about cool stuff, but then it declines after people get bored with it. So that's why it's nice to, or it's best to design a system that's good and then add gamification elements to make it better. And then, so extrinsically motivated rewards. So like I said before, it's good for monotonous tasks, but for creative tasks, it actually can reduce creativity and motivation in the task. So if you're giving people money for a creative task, usually that's not the best motivator, if they're already being paid enough at their job. So there may also be, oops, didn't put that. But there may also be legal and regulatory issues, which I can't talk about because I'm not a lawyer. It seems like there aren't any or many laws about gamification directly, but there could be privacy concerns or other things. And I think the professor who wrote the book For the Win, which I'm going to put up on the screen later, he's actually a lawyer, and he talks somewhat about like maybe some legal ramifications of implementing gamification. So here are a couple case studies. We have 9 minutes left, so I'll just go through some of these. So Autodesk that I mentioned earlier, they actually built this really wonderful system, like Carmen Sandiego, which was insanely popular, and kids learned a lot through that system. So they tried to mimic it, and it worked really well for customer acquisition. And if you don't know Autodesk, their products are quite expensive. I think their cheapest product might be like $1,200. But just having this gamified system to get people to interact more with their free trial period increased sales by 18%, which was huge for their company. And it gave users kind of this epic story and missions and quests to basically complete modeling things inside their software, which made it kind of fun and cool. So they thought, well, it worked for one piece of our software, so why wouldn't it work for all of our software combined? So they made like tried this. They figured it worked in one system and should work everywhere, but it failed, and their sales actually went down after they put in this gamified system, but went up after the other one. So then they realized we can't just throw random gamification elements in everywhere. We need to do some user testing. So they basically got rid of this whole game. They kept their other successful gamified implementation, of course, and then they added a progress bar. Instead of this whole thing, they just added a progress bar, and their sales increased just from that. So it's not always something complicated. There's no reason to overcomplicate things. Sometimes it's just really something simple that seems to work for their user acquisition. And I think it's important to talk about with Foursquare was that during the time when they really needed user adoption in their system, gamification worked really, really well. But unfortunately, while they were using gamification really effectively, I don't think they were making that much money, and their competitors were overtaking them. So they actually took their name recognition, their platform and branding, and all their user base, and they kind of rebranded or redid their company a little bit, and they took out a lot of the gamification elements from how they used them before. And the founder came out, because people were like, oh, gamification doesn't work, see Foursquare. And the founder, he did an interview and admitted that while it was successful, they had overemphasized gamification to the point where people didn't really take them seriously as a serious company. So they had to kind of rethink those elements. It helped them upfront get the users, but then how did they continue? It has to be part of a long-term plan there. So Microsoft, this is a really successful example. Microsoft is in a lot of languages everywhere, and they had a lot of bugs in their system. Not bugs, but like poor grammar or misspellings and things like that. So they wanted to create a system for people to flag it, or for their employees to flag errors in these screens that were localized all over the world and then fix it. So they created this language quality game where people could get points and things for fixing these issues with the language. So the result was 450 of their employees, even though they didn't have to, they reviewed 500,000 screens, over 500,000 screens, and improved translations based off their native language. It was a huge success. And actually, the Microsoft Office in Japan, they took a whole day in their work week. The whole office did just to review screens because it was so much fun to get these points for reviewing screens. So it really worked well for Microsoft. So 4 minutes. Perfect. So if you're interested in gamification, and I'll tweet these out later or after this talk, but these are the 3 books. I actually read, I think, about 7 or so books before this talk in the last 4 or 5 months. But these are the 3 best ones, I think, for getting started. And they're by people who are well known in this space. And yeah, this is me. If you Google Gwen Faraday, you'll find me pretty much everywhere online because there aren't too many people with my name. And there were a ton of researchers or resources and research papers and things around gamification. So I just stuck them on a page on my website. So if you're interested in more of the research and stuff, you can go there, and that way I could kind of continue to update it. And that's it. Thanks for coming. If you have any questions, you can come up here after and talk to me or, yeah. Oh, and please vote on your way out. Thanks.